For the first time in 2 millennia, a rare and quiet reversal is underway in the geography of global prestige, altering the trajectory of the world's most permanent monument. For 20 centuries, Rome functioned not merely as a capital but as an absolute standard for civilizational durability, an entity whose structural reality was presumed to be as immutable as its myth. Every generation made the predictable pilgrimage to stand within the Aurelian walls, seeking confirmation that some human fabrications could resist the erosion of time. Yet between the close of 2025 and the opening of 2026, an unmistakable divergence has materialized between the city's official projection and its operational reality. Mainstream economic reporting continues to cite aggregate arrival figures as evidence of vitality, obscuring a profound structural shift. The legend and the domestic reality have ceased to align. What is occurring across the Seven Hills is a documented fragmentation of the city's baseline functionality, the space where an imperial brand outlasts its physical utility. To understand the mechanics of this reversal, one must examine the baseline established in 2019, the absolute apex of the city's hypertourism model. In that year, Rome processed over 14 million international arrivals, a density that altered the physical character of the historic core. The micro-evidence of this saturation was visible at every primary junction: standing room-only density on the Spanish Steps by mid-morning, multi-hour queues flanking the Pantheon, and uniform capacity strains across the hospitality sector. The urban apparatus operated at maximum engineering tolerance, sustained entirely by the momentum of its own historical status. When global transit resumed after the systemic pauses of the early 2020s, official models predicted a linear restoration of this baseline. The aggregate numbers did return, but the internal composition of those numbers underwent a severe structural mutation. The critical divergence lies in the stealth departure of the high-value traveler, the demographic that allocates significant capital to multi-week itineraries, professional guiding services, and verified hospitality assets. Internal metrics from boutique agencies in London and Frankfurt reveal a measurable rerouting of these specific capital flows away from the Lazio region. Why is this divide so exceptionally large? Because the contemporary traveler increasingly prioritizes systemic efficiency and civic competence over inherited prestige. While official municipal statements highlight record passenger volumes at Fiumicino, private travel registries indicate that premium accounts are shifting destinations toward Athens, Lisbon, and Kyoto. The underlying sentiment, captured in off-the-record trade assessments, indicates that Rome has transitioned from a destination that hosts visitors to an extraction mechanism that merely processes them. This friction points to a systemic pattern observable in the late stages of historic urban centers. It is the precise mechanical sequence that surfaced in late Byzantine Constantinople, where catastrophic infrastructure decay left magnificent imperial monuments isolated within landscapes of systemic neglect. It parallels late Victorian London, where global financial dominance collided directly with the functional collapse of its internal municipal districts. The architectural brand continues to command premium status globally, while the immediate physical product deteriorates. The momentum of the myth sustains the economy for a finite period, as human expectations require clear evidence before updating long-held geographical hierarchies. In 2026, that evidence has reached a critical density. The primary structural crack manifests within the physical infrastructure of transit, where the city's ancient topography paralyzes modern engineering. Rome's municipal transit apparatus is tasked with moving 3 million permanent residents alongside an active daily influx of 400,000 transient visitors. To achieve this, the city relies on just 2 fully operational metro lines designed and executed in the 1970s, leaving over 70% of the urban geography disconnected from rail transit. The expansion project known as Line C has remained in an active construction phase since 2006. The 20-year delay is not a consequence of mere bureaucratic inertia, but of a fundamental spatial contradiction. Any subterranean excavation inevitably intersects archaeological layers from the classical era, triggering immediate, legally mandated preservation halts. The city is structurally prohibited from modernizing because it is physically built upon its own unexcavated past. This paralysis yields immediate, localized consequences for the urban experience. During summer periods characterized by routine 40-degree heat corridors, A passenger arriving at Stazione Termini encounters a transport deficit defined by 90-minute taxi queues, an unpredictable surface bus fleet, and an obsolete transfer layout. For an aging demographic traveling to inspect the Vatican or the Borghese collections, these factors transcend simple logistical friction. They constitute a severe deterrent to repeat visitation. The broader economic consequences are already visible within macro data streams. Google Trends data demonstrates a sustained relative decline in travel intent queries for Rome when measured against regional competitors over a 36-month window. The affluent demographics that the municipality requires to subsidize its expense preservation costs are systematically removing the capital from their itineraries. The secondary structural fracture operates under the mechanism of resident displacement and civic resentment. In the summer of 2024, the municipal administration enacted an array of restrictive ordinances designed to police human behavior within the historic center. Fines reaching 400 downs were established for consuming food on historic stairways, access points to landmark fountains were restricted, and restrictions were placed on transit options within specific Old World neighborhoods. While framed as conservation measures, these policies confirm a deeper systemic crisis. The city administration has lost the capacity to balance its primary economic engine with basic urban order. The most severe diagnostic indicator, however, is the absolute demographic hollow-out of the resident population within the Aurelian walls. In 1970, the historic center maintained a living population of approximately 250,000 residents, supporting localized commerce, neighborhood bakeries, and authentic domestic life. By 2026, that figure has contracted to fewer than 80,000 individuals. The mechanisms driving this exodus are structural and uniform. Exponential rent inflation, the systemic conversion of long-term housing stock into short-term tourist rentals, and the transformation of functional neighborhoods into static, open-air commercial zones. The organic human fabric that historically defined the Roman urban experience has been displaced by a synthetic service economy catering exclusively to brief, low-margin stays. As authentic communities recede, the qualitative traveler retreats as well. How about seeking destinations like Bologna or Naples where the urban fabric remains supported by an active domestic population? Rome's historic core is rapidly transitioning into a highly detailed stage set, architecturally unparalleled, yet increasingly devoid of the localized social energy that prevents a historic city from becoming a museum clone. Beneath this superficial tourist economy sits a structural stagnation that characterizes the wider national landscape. Italy's real GDP growth has averaged below 1% annually for nearly a quarter of a century. Youth unemployment consistently hovers at double the broader European average, and the demographic trajectory indicates a projected 12% drop in total national population by mid-century. As the administrative center, Rome mirrors these systemic pressures. The municipal bureaucracy demands an average of 54 days and a complex sequence of regulatory steps merely to authorize a new commercial enterprise. Concurrently, the city's landmark institutions remain critically under-resourced. The Colosseum generates massive annual revenues, yet these funds are managed by centralized entities entangled in systemic budgetary disputes, preventing the capital from being reinvested directly into the municipal transit or waste networks of the surrounding city. The visual evidence of this fiscal disconnect is omnipresent. Structural scaffolding left static on public facades for decades, historic fountains operating on restricted hydraulic schedules, and public squares designed for grandeur left exposed to systemic maintenance deficits. A terminal date approaches for economies that consume their historical capital without executing capital renewal. Rome is not facing an abrupt industrial abandonment, nor is it mimicking the rapid manufacturing collapse of the American Rust Belt. The mechanism here is slower, more accurate, and profoundly more difficult to reverse. The erosion occurs within the hidden metrics, in the steady decline of average visitor expenditure, in the collapse of return visit intent, and in the growing volume of departures among the city's educated youth. The myth of the Eternal City is encountering the limits of its modern execution, revealing a structural deficit that marketing campaigns can no longer conceal. The critical indicators suggest that the baseline narrative is shifting from an inquiry of historical discovery to a calculated assessment of structural viability, as the hidden lines of decline begin to trace a new and challenging path across the ancient stone. But the macro data and transit deficits only register the surface of this structural divergence. To witness the true velocity of Rome's transformation, one must move past the train stations and the municipal reports and look directly at the microeconomies operating within the historic rioni, the traditional districts that for centuries formed the economic bedrock of the capital. Here, the erosion of the permanent city manifests not as a sudden cataclysm, but as a silent, systematic replacement of authentic commercial diversity with a low-margin monocultural infrastructure. The physical details of this shift are legible on every street corner. Prati and Trastevere, long-standing artisanal workshops, generational tailors, and neighborhood food markets are vanishing at a measurable cadence, replaced by an endless repetition of automated luggage storage lockers, standard-sized souvenir stalls, and fast casual food outlets designed for rapid transactional consumption. The spatial reality of this commercial decay is defined by what is missing. Step into the side streets of the Campo de' Fiori or the Rione of Monte during the early evening hours, and the traditional acoustic landscape of the city is noticeably absent. The authentic clamor of local residents, neighborhood commerce, and localized dialects has been replaced by the uniform hum of rolling suitcase wheels on cobblestones and the sterile glow of digital lockboxes affixed to historic stone portals. Entire residential entryways have been retrofitted with keyless entry pads, converting historic palazzi into unstaffed vertical hotels. This is a landscape where the structural architecture remains intact, but the functional purpose has been completely extracted. The small independent grocery shops that once served the neighborhood elderly have been systematically priced out by exponential commercial rent inflation, leaving behind dark windows filled with handwritten lease termination signs, soon to be refitted as automated express marts. This structural shift is driven by a deep institutional distortion within the real estate market. Across the historic center, regular residential leases have effectively ceased to exist for Italian nationals. A comprehensive analysis of real estate registries within the Aurelian walls indicates that over 65% of available housing stock has been absorbed by short-term rental platforms, generating yields that an average Roman salary, stagnant under the weight of national economic flatlining, cannot possibly match. The median net monthly income for a young professional in Rome hovers around 1,400s, while the average rent for a modest one-bedroom apartment in the center has escalated past 1,200s. This stark mathematical imbalance creates an absolute barrier to entry for the younger demographic, forcing a brutal generational exile to distant, disconnected suburbs like Guidonia or Ostia. Center is thus preserved exclusively for those who do not live there, creating a demographic desert that empties of domestic life the moment the tourist season experiences its seasonal dips. The economic consequences of this hollowing out have severely impacted the city's foundational hospitality and restaurant sectors. In the traditional Roman trattoria, a delicate balance historically existed between local patronage and international visitors, ensuring a consistent standard of culinary execution and financial stability throughout the year. In 2026, that balance has completely collapsed. Driven by predatory lease renewals, local restaurateurs are forced to choose between closing entirely or pivoting to a high turnover, low-quality model optimized for single-visit travelers who will never return. The sensory details of this transition are clear, menus translated into 6 languages, with faded stock photos of pasta displayed on plastic stands, mass-produced, pre-frozen ingredients defrosted in industrial microwaves, and tables packed tightly together to maximize volumetric throughput per hour. The local Romans have stopped entering these establishments entirely, creating an absolute segregation between the tourist experience and the real life of the city. This commercial degradation has triggered a profound institutional crisis within Rome's luxury hospitality sector, an industry that should serve as the city's highest margin economic driver. Over the past 24 months, international luxury hospitality brands have injected billions of euros into the Roman market, opening ultra-premium 5-star properties in historic palazzi, betting on the premise that affluent travelers would happily subsidize high room rates to experience the eternal city. However, internal industry metrics indicate that while these properties achieve high initial bookings based on brand momentum, their occupancy rates drop significantly during the off-peak months, failing to secure the critical repeat clientele that sustains premium hospitality. The systemic cause is an acute, paralyzing labor deficit, The city's hollowed-out demographic core means there is no longer a localized, professional workforce capable of sustaining five-star service standards. The younger Italians who historically trained for elite hospitality careers are fleeing the capital in record numbers, migrating to Switzerland, the United Kingdom, or the United Arab Emirates, where compensation structures match the cost of living and professional merit is insulated from bureaucratic nepotism. Consequently, luxury hotels in Rome are forced to staff their operations with low-wage, temporary contract workers who lack traditional hospitality training and possess no long-term stake in the city's economic future. Affluent guests paying upwards of $1,500 per night find themselves confronted with broken property amenities, language barriers, and a total absence of the highly polished, intuitive service that defines luxury destinations like Tokyo or London. The high-net-worth traveler does not tolerate systemic inefficiency. When the reality of an expensive stay descends into logistical friction and amateur execution, that capital flow permanently realigns with smoother, more functional international markets. This operational failure extends directly into the management of Rome's peerless cultural assets. The state-run museums, archaeological parks, and historic villas operate under a rigid, highly centralized administrative framework that treats cultural heritage as a static resource to be guarded rather than an active asset to be maintained. On an average day in 2026, visitors to major historical complexes encounter closed galleries due to sudden unannounced staff shortages, broken climate control systems that threaten ancient frescoes, and non-functional ticketing infrastructure that forces thousands into chaotic, unmanaged queues under the open sun. Why is this mismanagement so pervasive? Because the revenue generated by these world-class assets is systematically diverted into the centralized national treasury to service Italy's massive sovereign debt and fund expansive public pensions, rather than being reinvested directly into the preservation and staffing of the sites themselves. The monuments are effectively being mined to stall a broader national fiscal crisis. The result is an urban environment that feels increasingly exhausting to navigate, even for those deeply committed to its historical legacy. The physical details of this exhaustion are visible in the silent lobbies of boutique hotels, watching their reservation windows shrink in the abandoned cultural projects left half-finished behind rusted construction fences, and in the growing weariness of the remaining local shopkeepers who realize they are surviving on the periphery of an economy that no longer recognizes their value. The city's administrative leadership continues to deploy defensive rhetoric, asserting that Rome remains an indispensable global destination by pointing to the sheer volume of low-budget cruise ship day trippers processed through the port of Civitavecchia. But this volume is an economic illusion. It fills the streets with foot traffic while contributing virtually nothing to the long-term tax base or the structural maintenance of the urban infrastructure. The structural erosion of Rome has advanced past the point of simple policy corrections or targeted municipal subsidies. The divergence between the myth of permanence and the reality of operational decay has set a deeper transformation in motion, one that alters the very nature of how global capital, talent, and prestige interact with the capital. The city is gradually losing its capacity to inspire aspiration, transitioning instead into a warning study of what happens when an empire's greatest asset becomes a museum piece to be exploited until the machinery breaks down entirely. The foundational columns remain standing, but the civic architecture that bound them together has fundamentally destabilized. Yet the most surprising layer of this civilizational retreat remains completely hidden beneath the political surface. Behind these statistics are real lives kind of being reshaped by the cold geometry of economic displacement. The structural hollowing of Rome is not merely a transformation of real estate registries or municipal tax bases. It is a profound human migration that is quietly altering the generational lineage of the capital. To observe this human cost, one must look away from the monuments and toward the peripheral ring roads, the concrete margins where the actual Roman population now reconstructs its life. Districts like Tor Pignatara, Centocelle, and the severe housing blocks of Corviale, families that maintained ancestral ties to the historic center for centuries, are learning to navigate a deeply fragmented urban existence. The sensory details of this exile are found in the crowded, unair-conditioned commuter trains of the Roma-Lido line, where workers spend 3 hours a day transit-bound journeying back into a historic center they can no longer afford to inhabit, simply to service the properties of those who do. The human dimension of this crisis is defined by a quiet, pervasive sense of loss, a realization among the remaining populace that their city has been systematically repurposed. Consider the daily routine of the third-generation Roman craftsman operating a vanishing metal workshop on the periphery of Trastevere. His mornings no longer begin with the familiar social rituals of a neighborhood cafe where the barista knew every family name. Instead, he unlocks his shutters facing an empty street of dark windows, surrounded by short-term apartments occupied by transient groups who stay for 48 hours and interact only with digital lockboxes. The local networks of mutual aid, the casual conversations across balconies, and the shared memory of the neighborhood have been completely evacuated. Why is this domestic fabric vanishing so completely? Because a community cannot survive when its physical infrastructure is transformed into a high-turnover consumer product. The loss is acoustic, social, and psychological. It is the death of a living city by 1,000 tiny commercial replacements. This displacement scales upward into a severe generational severance that threatens Italy's intellectual and economic future. For young Roman university graduates, those who completed their degrees at Sapienza or Tor Vergata, the capital has effectively become a closed ecosystem. The combination of stagnant entry-level salaries, frequently structured as irregular, low-wage internships paying less than $800 a month, and an hyper-inflated housing market makes independent life inside the city a mathematical impossibility. This economic trap drives an unprecedented brain drain that the national government routinely downplays. On an average week in 2026, the departures at Fiumicino Airport do not consist merely of departing tourists, but of young Roman engineers, researchers, and physicians carrying one-way tickets to Munich, Paris, or Amsterdam. They leave behind an aging, structurally vulnerable population that possesses fewer resources each year to maintain the basic civic fabric of the capital. The human cost is equally severe for the vulnerable labor force that underpins the tourism apparatus itself. Beneath the glossy promotions of Roman culinary culture and luxury hospitality lies a precarious, invisible network of low-wage workers who bear the immediate physical brunt of the city's operational friction. These are the chambermaids, kitchen porters, and sanitation laborers, many of them first-generation immigrants, who operate under highly exploitative contract structures known locally as cooperative. They clean 20 short-term apartments a day for sub-minimum wages, moving through a fractured transit system that frequently leaves them stranded in far-flung suburban developments well past midnight. Their exhaustion is a core component of the contemporary Roman economy. Their underpaid labor is the hidden subsidy that allows low-cost tourism operators to maintain profitability while the municipal infrastructure collapses around them. When a bus delays or a metro line fails, it is these workers who face immediate wage deductions and employment insecurity, absorbing the systemic failures of the state on behalf of an indifferent market. This structural exploitation has altered the very psychology of the remaining population, replacing traditional Roman warmth with a palpable defensive exhaustion. The interactions between locals and visitors have taken on a sharp transactional edge. In the remaining neighborhood markets of Testaccio, elderly residents must navigate stalls that have shifted their inventory from fresh produce to vacuum-sealed packages of industrial pasta designed for suitcase transport. The local dialect, once a rich vehicle for community narrative and sharp satire, is increasingly reserved for expressions of shared frustration regarding broken escalators, uncollected municipal waste, and the absolute indifference of the political class. The city has reached a state of internal psychological siege. The Romans look at the endless waves of international arrivals not as a source of cultural pride or economic vitality, but as an occupying demographic force that drives their children from their homes and converts their historic inheritance into an unlivable playground. The political leadership of the capital remains trapped within a paradigm of absolute denial, staging elaborate public relations campaigns and bidding for international mega-events to maintain the illusion of global relevance. But these initiatives act as fiscal black holes, diverting scarce public funds into massive short-term construction contracts that do nothing to address the structural deficits of the wider metropolitan area. The money flows into temporary pavilions and security apparatuses, while the peripheral public schools deteriorate, Suburban clinics face closure due to lack of funding, and the city's basic municipal services remain paralyzed. It is an urban policy structure modeled entirely on appearance, a desperate attempt to project the image of a functional, global metropolis while the underlying human and physical foundations crumble from systematic disinvestment. This brings the narrative back to its essential, sobering truth. The decline of Rome in 2026 is not a spectacle of sudden destruction, but a quiet, structural unwinding of permanence. The city is proving that it is entirely possible for an urban center to remain world-famous, architecturally magnificent, and intensely profitable for international real estate funds, while simultaneously dying as a human community. The tragedy of modern Rome is that its extraordinary historical legacy has become its primary economic curse. The myth is so immensely valuable that the living city must be cannibalized to sustain it. The empire is not falling to external barbarians, it is being hollowed out from within by the logic of absolute commodification, turning an ancient, vibrant civilization into a sterile, high-yield financial asset. The final image of this transformation is not found in the grand archaeological vistas, but in the quiet, late-night reality of a historic alleyway near the Piazza Navona. As the midnight hour passes, the remaining traditional trattoria closes its doors for the final time, its owner having lost a legal battle against a 300% lease increase mandated by an offshore investment group. Across the narrow street, the yellow light of an automated